Hello everybody. Thanks again for visiting my YouTube channel. This is the place where we discuss the Lord's Recovery Movement of Witness Lee, also known as the Local Church Movement. Just yesterday I put out episode 119, which was addressing the articles on shepherdingwords.com published in June of 2023, which was all about apostles and co-workers and the independence or autonomy of churches and how those things work together according to the Lord's recovery. I pointed out strongly that I did not believe there were any more apostles. That's what most of the church believes. And that the clearest verse in the Bible about what qualifies someone to be an apostle is 2 Corinthians 12:12, in which Paul says, I displayed the marks of a true apostle in all patience, performing signs, wonders, and miracles. Now, I got a comment on the video from a Lord's Recovery member, and he had some questions and points. He took a lot of time to write a long comment, which he edited and even footnoted his edits. And this seemed to be in his own words. And so I thought it was a great way to answer some questions that some other people might have as well. So I'm going to put the comment in the video. I'm not going to tell you his name, and I want to protect his privacy as much as I can. I'm going to read it and answer his questions as I go. So let's get started. His first statement is, you say that the definition provided is a proprietary definition. Now what he's talking about is the definition of an apostle as stated by shepherdingwords.com in the February 2020 article, Questions and Answers about Apostles and Co-workers. And I read that in the previous video. He asks about it. However, they have provided at least 12 verses from the New Testament to support that definition. Which of these verses does their definition contradict? If it doesn't contradict any of them, why reject it? I did not reject those verses as being evidence of something. What I meant was those were not necessarily evidence for being an apostle. For example, let's go through some of them. In the article, what are the qualifications of an apostle? For a person to be an apostle, he must possess certain basic qualifications. First, he must receive the revelation of God's New Testament economy concerning Christ and the church. And they cite 5 verses, but it's 2 sections. One in Matthew said, and Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in the heavens. And I also say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And then Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, for I make known to you, brothers, concerning the gospel announced by me, that is not according to man. For neither did I receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, this is talking about Jesus giving revelation to Peter and then Paul. Okay, Peter and Paul were apostles, and apostles got revelation. But neither of these verses show that they received a revelation of God's New Testament economy. It doesn't say that. Obviously, the apostles received revelation, but there's nothing here that says that they received a revelation of God's New Testament economy, which we all know is Lord's Recovery speak for Witness Lee's theology. So these are pretty weak in defining an apostle. Second, revelation here is talking about a direct revelation of something nobody has ever seen before from God. It's talking about the revelation of Jesus Christ, who he was and is. It's not talking about somebody getting insights into the Bible. It's talking about a direct revelation from God to the men who helped write the New Testament. So obviously apostles get revelation, and obviously they got it from Jesus Christ. But this doesn't really say that this is a qualification of an apostle. And actually you could say this means Witness Lee wasn't an apostle, because this is talking about direct revelation. It's talking about something directly from the Lord without the help of the New Testament. And so Witness Lee didn't get that, and if he did, then he's adding to the New Testament. So either you're a Bible interpreter or you're an apostle who gets direct revelation from God. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get insights into what the Bible means, but that's different from getting direct revelation of something new that's not in the Bible because the New Testament wasn't even written yet. And again, this is not anything that says this is the qualification of an apostle. Moving on, second, he must be able to minister the unsearchably rich Christ as the gospel and betroth sinners to Christ for his satisfaction. And the verses are Galatians 1:16, to reveal his Son in me, that I might announce him as the gospel among the Gentiles. Immediately I did not confer with flesh and blood. Now Ephesians 3:8, to me, less than the least of all saints, was this grace given to announce to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ as the gospel. And then 2 Corinthians 11:2, for I am jealous over you with jealousy of God, for I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. In this case, this is talking about Paul's commission, but it doesn't say this is a specific commission of an apostle. Paul was an apostle and this was his commission, but it doesn't say that this was a specific commission related to being an apostle uniquely, because can't anyone now preach the unsearchably rich Christ as the gospel? Can't anyone now act in a way to betroth sinners to Jesus, their Savior? You can do these things now and not be an apostle. So I'm not certain how this is a strong definition of what an apostle was. Then it says, third, he must be able to raise up local churches and to raise up men from among the saints and appoint them as elders for leading, shepherding, teaching, and overseeing the church. And he cites Acts 14:23, and when they had appointed elders for them in every church and had prayed with fastings, they committed them to the Lord, into whom they had believed. Titus 1:5, for this cause I left you in Crete, that you might set in order the things which I have begun that remain, and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. In one, they talk about appointing elders in every church and then in every city, and the Lord's Recovery makes a connection that the city and the church were the same thing in this case. Again, this is kind of a circular argument, because what they're saying is only apostles can appoint elders. Therefore, if you appoint elders, you must be an apostle. Another way of saying that is if you don't have apostles, you can't appoint elders. This is kind of the way they think. We can't appoint elders because only apostles can appoint elders, so we have to have apostles. So let's go find an apostle. Again, I'll take you back to the 2nd century when there were many church fathers like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria and Justin Martyr and these early church fathers. They were very highly respected and followed, and yet none of them in any of their writings mentioned knowing any apostles or that they were apostles. And yet they had churches, and we have to assume these churches had elders. So how did these elders get appointed if there were no apostles during that time? So the idea that you must have an apostle to get an elder is pretty facetious. So I don't think that's a good argument. Now, the apostles in the 1st century did appoint elders, but just the fact that you appoint elders doesn't make you an apostle. And just because you don't have an apostle doesn't mean you can't have any elders. So I'll stop there on that one. I don't want to drone on and on about it. But the point is he's saying these are descriptions or attributes of apostles. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm just saying that just because you have those attributes doesn't make you an apostle. And that's the difference between these verses and 2 Corinthians 12:12. Because 2 Corinthians 12:12 is the clearest, most specific verse in the Bible that talks about a qualification of being an apostle. It's very clear. Paul says a true apostle could work signs and wonders, and he could, so he was a true apostle. That wasn't the only reason he was. This listener's mistake here is he's making a false assumption. He says, in contrast, you, as I understand it, hold that 2 Corinthians 12:12 is the unique verse in the New Testament that defines an apostle. No, that is not what I believe. What I'm saying is that is the clearest verse in the Bible that gives a qualification of an apostle. It's not the only qualification. Obviously, you can see what the apostles did from verses like the ones you showed. But this is the verse that actually states clearly and definitely, and there's no way around it, that an apostle could work signs and wonders. he goes on to talk about how Paul defends his ministry. And he talks about a lot of other things: his warring, his jealousy in Christ, his labor, his afflictions, his revelation, his authority. If signs are all that are needed, why wouldn't Paul focus on this all-proving criterion? In contrast, he mentions signs and wonders only briefly in one verse, yet spends much more time talking about his other qualifications. Well, I would say that the last one he states is the linchpin. I mean, that's the sealer. That's the one they can't get around, and that's why he saved it for last. But it doesn't mean that anybody that can work a miracle is an apostle, or that's the only qualification of being an apostle. It just means that, as the verse states, it is a qualification that you must have. You must have it. And then he goes down the rabbit hole of his own digging here. He says, moreover, the New Testament makes it perfectly clear that others besides apostles can perform the miraculous. Otherwise, the Lord will not need to warn of false Christs and false prophets who lead others astray with great signs and wonders. Yes, that's true. You need the whole package, but you need the whole package. To make myself very plain, it's not that if you can work miracles, you're an apostle. And it's not that Jesus didn't say that false prophets might be able to work miracles. The point is, it does say that real apostles will be able to work miracles. That's what it says. Let me repeat that. Real apostles will be able to work miracles. That's what 2 Corinthians 12:12 establishes. As for false prophets, the second beast that does great signs to deceive the whole earth, we're talking about somebody who preaches the gospel of Christ here. We're not talking about some demon-possessed guy who says everybody's God, or the Antichrist is God, or this and that, or Jesus is a fake, or any of those things. We're talking about somebody who preaches the gospel of Christ. You should be able to discern those two. The Bible says clearly in 2 Corinthians 12:12 that true apostles of Christ could work signs and wonders. I think we should talk a little bit about what Paul was actually doing in 2 Corinthians and what he was talking about. Paul was defending himself. He was saying the Corinthians didn't think much of him. They looked at him and they say, look at this guy. He's not very impressive. He's struggling. He's kind of beaten up. He has to work for himself. He doesn't talk that strongly. He doesn't seem that confident. Paul talks about these super apostles. Now, it's a consensus that the super apostles are actually false apostles. Because what happened during their time, there were people going around, even Jews, claiming to be apostles. And they would actually go in and teach some false teaching or teach something that the people wanted to hear, and they would give them money. And it was a scam. And Paul is defending himself. And why does he talk about his labors, his afflictions, and all this kind of stuff? Because he's saying, I'm suffering for the gospel. I'm suffering for the real gospel, and that's why I'm suffering. Because I've got the truth here. That's what he's saying. Whereas these super apostles would waltz in with all their success and their boasting and their flamboyance and impress people superficially that said, how can this Paul guy be an apostle? Look at these guys. They're so impressive outwardly. And that's what he's getting at here. And so he seals it by saying these guys can't work signs and wonders. Then he goes on to say, nor there is a record of the apostles Barnabas, Apollos, Matthias, Timothy, Silas, and Jacocus and Junia performing miracles. Therefore, the assumption that signs and wonders are the unique way to prove an apostle is baseless. Well, just because the Bible doesn't record it doesn't mean that 2 Corinthians 12:12 is invalid. There's no record of Barnabas or Apollos, Matthias, Silas, Andronicus, and Junia preaching the unsearchable riches of Christ, or that they knew God's New Testament economy. There's not a record of that either, but you assume they do. So what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. The Bible doesn't have to record every apostle performing a miracle to prove that 2 Corinthians 12:12 is true. You just believe 2 Corinthians 12:12. Now, if there was a verse in the Bible that said Apollos could not perform miracles, then you'd have to go, okay, 2 Corinthians 12:12 means something different than it seems to mean. But it doesn't do that. Paul said plainly, the mark of a true apostle is the ability to work signs, wonders, and miracles. Just read it and believe it and say amen to it and stop trying to argue with it, because Witness Lee couldn't do it. And let me ask you a question. Let me just throw out a hypothetical here. Suppose there was a verse like 2 Corinthians 12:12 that Paul wrote somewhere else in the Bible. And suppose it said, the mark of a true church is that it meets as the church in the city according to the genuine ground of oneness. Suppose there was such a verse as that. Wouldn't you be jumping all over it and saying, this is proof? Here it is. How can you deny this? How can you get around this? There's no case. There's no debate. Here it is right here. Wouldn't you be doing that if there was a verse that said that? That would be the trump card, wouldn't it? Well, this is a similar trump card. Okay, the verse is actually there, not the one that you pretend is there. There is no such verse. And I'll get into more of that later. A few other thoughts. You say that the recovery don't believe God can speak through others. This, of course, is a lie. For example, Witness Lee spoke very highly of Billy Graham. Yes, I know he did. But do you sell any of Billy Graham's books in your bookstore? Have you ever recommended that anybody read any of Billy Graham's books? Have you ever recommended that anybody watch Billy Graham videos, which, by the way, are amazing, and they're on YouTube? And just search for classic Billy Graham and watch that. They will blow you away. A little story about me. When I was a young teenager, I was raised a Catholic, and they used to have the Billy Graham Crusade on TV. And occasionally I would be at home alone, and I'd just be flipping channels and I'd hit it, and it just riveted me, I knew this guy was speaking the truth. I mean, it was like God was speaking to me. None of my family was there, and somebody would come in the door and I'd change the channel because I didn't want them to know I was watching Billy Graham. That's my testimony. Yeah, absolutely. Billy Graham was fantastic. So why not read a book by Billy Graham? When the Lord's Recovery recommends teachers that aren't in the Lord's Recovery, it's almost always someone who's historical, not somebody who's current. What teacher or what teaching or what book does the Lord's Recovery recommend that is contemporary today? They've always recommended the Brethren teachings and Andrew Murray and John Nelson Darby and this kind of stuff, all this historical stuff, but anything current they don't recommend. Has the Lord Recovery ever invited a speaker to speak in any of their meetings who is not in the Lord's Recovery? No. They actually recommend you stay away from books that are not released by the Lord's Recovery. And they do not want anybody in the Lord's Recovery to write anything that they don't approve. They are trying to keep a very tight control over the message. Now, does that sound like people that respect the rest of the body of Christ? So this is an example of just bad argumentation. Yeah, you can probably find something in the past where Witness Lee said something nice about somebody. But overall, what's the message in the Lord's Recovery? You don't need anything that's not in the Lord's Recovery. That's their message. Actually, when I was in the Lord's Recovery in Texas, Benson Phillips would often say, you don't need anything that's out there. We got it all here. Okay, that was the message I heard. He goes on to say, you ask, what were the local churches? They were all the Christians in the city. I heartily agree. Well, we agree on something. That's great. But then you declare there is nothing in the Bible that makes it clear that they were all organized together under one group of elders. Then he says, nonsense, 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 nonsense. There is nothing that makes it clear. It's not clear. It's not nonsense. I just stated the fact. There is nothing in the Bible that suggests they were not under one group of elders. Well, okay, so we don't know. If both are true, then we don't know, and you can't insist upon it. I mean, how difficult is that? Acts 14:23, together with Titus 1:5, adequately prove that each city had a church and each church had an elder. Well, I don't think it's adequate. We disagree on that, okay? And a lot of people disagree with you. So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to say their churches aren't churches because of that? Because they talked about appointing elders in every city and then appointing elders in every church, and another verse follow that proves it? It proves it. Proves. Proves a tough word. That's hardly proof in my book. And let me talk again about house churches. The Bible mentions house churches in several places. It does not make clear that those churches were the actual city church, as Watchman Nee and Witness Lee try to claim. If you just read the verses, let's start out with what I think is the strongest case in the book of Romans, where Paul addresses the letter to the Romans to the believers in Romans. He doesn't address it to the church. And he spends the whole 16 chapters talking to the believers in Rome about the gospel. And at the end of it, Paul talks about, he goes, greet this person, greet that person, greet the other person, say hello. And then he says, and greet the church which is in the house of Priscilla and Aquila. He spent the whole time talking to the believers in Rome, and then he turns around and says, greet the church in their house. Now that doesn't make any sense to say all the believers he's been talking to are the same as the church in the house of Aquila and Priscilla, because you wouldn't do that. You would start out saying to the church, and then you would talk about believers. You wouldn't say greet the church at the very end when you're already talking to the church, if that's what he indeed was doing. Another point is that I brought out in a previous message is this is 58 AD and this is Rome. How big was Rome? What was the population of Rome in 58 AD? What do you think it was? 50,000 people, 100,000, 300,000? The estimate of the population of Rome in 58 AD was 1.2 million people. Now, of those people, how many of them do you think were Christians in 58 AD? This is almost 30 years after the Lord left the earth. Paul's been ministering for a long time. How big do you think the church in Rome is in a city of 1.2 million people? We're talking about all the Christians, right, in the city. How many do you think are there? Now, do you think Aquila and Priscilla had a house big enough to hold all those people to meet together? I doubt it. But Paul says the church is at their house. Now, this isn't talking about a meeting hall. So don't say, well, they had a lot of different places to meet. No, he said, greet the church at their house. That means that the church had to be able to fit in their house in a city of 1.2 million people. So either they hadn't done a very good job of spreading the gospel in Rome by 58 AD, or the church in Rome couldn't fit in Aquila and Priscilla's house, yet Paul called it a church. He called a subset of the church in Rome a church. That's just logic. Okay, that's reasonable. That is the logical thing to think. And the only reason you would think anything different is as you've got a preconceived notion that the church in the house of Aquila and Priscilla must be all the Christians in Rome. But I will ask again, could all the Christians in Rome in 58 AD fit into the house of Aquila and Priscilla? And the answer is most likely not. Therefore, it's illogical to say that the church in the house, and in the other mentions of churches and houses in the New Testament, of which there are 3 others at least, are necessarily also the church in the city. As I've stated before, it's easy to consider Paul talking to the church in the city just talking about all the Christians in the city, not an organization under one group of elders. Then he quotes me, would it be great in a way if all the Christians in the city could just be one church? But what is the price you pay to insist on that? The price you pay is the price the Lord requires, that we deny ourselves. Well, he didn't nearly answer the question I asked. I said, what is the price you pay to insist on that? Not to have that, to insist on it. They're different things. That we deny ourselves? We deny ourselves. Not the people that are insisting on it, but the people that have to knuckle under to their insistence. Because they're insisting on something the Bible does not insist on. Why are you insisting on something the Bible does insist on? As I said, if there was a verse like 2 Corinthians 12:12 talking about the local ground, saying the marks of a true church is that it meets as the church in the city on the genuine ground of oneness, you guys would have that plastered everywhere. But that verse doesn't exist. There is no insistence on this, and there is enough evidence about house churches to put it in doubt, which means you shouldn't be insisting on it. You shouldn't be insisting on it. If you want to meet that way, that's your business. But to talk about this as if he goes on to say, rather, what's the price you pay to disregard it? The endless division and chaos of denominational Christianity. Well, you've had a lot of chaos in the Lord's recovery too. The idea that if everybody just knuckles under to the bosses and does what they say, then all this division would be solved. Dude, that's what every megalomaniac in history has ever said. If everybody just listens to me and do what I say, we'd have peace in the world. You know, that was the Empire's line in Star Wars. Order in the galaxy if everybody just comes under the control of the Empire. I mean, it's the same thing. Yes, Christians should be one, But the Bible never says that some bosses get to insist that everybody meet with them. And if you think this is going to solve all the problems, then you're crazy. Because I know for a fact in San Francisco there were like 4 churches that claimed to be the church in the city. How do you decide which one is the church in the city? I mean, it doesn't solve division. You're going to have problems with people disagreeing. And what's your solution? Well, let's appoint a poobah. Let's make it Witness Lee. And it's just a top-down control. You just have one boss at the top telling everybody what to do. I mean, again, that's the formula of every megalomaniac that's ever existed. That is not God's New Testament economy. He said he would put his laws in our hearts, and no one would have to say to you, know the Lord, for all shall know me. God's way has always been leading people by leading individuals, and that their oneness is something that comes from the heart in cooperation. It doesn't come top down from some kind of controlling organization. So you can pat yourself on the back all day about how you are solving the problem of division. You're not. You're helping cause it by your attitude. It's proven by the fact that you will not associate with any other Christians hardly, any other Christian groups. Okay, and you can talk all day about how they're meeting on the wrong ground. I will say again, the Bible does not insist on that. It does not insist on that. And imagine if it did. Imagine if the Bible did have that verse. What would we have? What would it look like? We'd have somebody in control of all the Christians in the city. And those people in control might not be somebody who you agree with in their theology. Do you ever think about that? It would just be a power struggle. And you'd still have division. You just have people breaking out saying, no, we're the church in the city. No, we're the church in the city. No, we are. Why? Because we got the best teachings. No, you don't. We do. I mean, it just adds up to a fight. Christians need to cooperate and get along. But there's nothing in the Bible that says we need to cooperate with that, because it's just a setup to have somebody in charge. It doesn't work. And that's why I believe the Lord didn't command it. Because if it was as important as you say it is, and it's such a big deal and the missing link to all goodness and truth, then don't you think he would have said, do this? He said we got to believe in Jesus. He said we have to have faith. He said we need to believe in the resurrection. He said we need to believe God is one and Jesus is his only son, and that he came to earth and died for our sins and resurrected, and belief in him gets us salvation. He said all that clearly. Why didn't he say this other thing clearly if it's so important? I hate to say duh, but that's a duh. Okay? But brother, I do appreciate you writing to me. I enjoyed reviewing this. I appreciate you taking the time to do it. Please do it again. I think you have written something before a long time ago. I kind of recognize the name. So anyway, thanks again for listening, guys. Take care.